Enemy.
Dramatic character who was the sort of strong, silent type. And then when I reread it, I suddenly realised actually he never stops talking. And there's an element to him where he's actually very theatrical in the book. The way he speaks, he's this sort of larger-than-life character.
Sit. Not you, pilot. Miss Eyre, excuse me, I'm used to giving orders and having them obeyed. Sit, if you please.
If I was as theatrical as he is in the book, I don't think it would hold on screen. He would seem too much, whereas in the book it holds absolutely.
Yeah.
You love him. You know he's a very interesting character.
Rochester, I think, is based on a much more literary fantasy. The Bronte sisters were hugely influenced by the literature of an earlier period, particularly by Byron. And, of course, Jane Eyre is set in that period, and Rochester is the sort of archetypal Regency rake.
I know nothing of this Mr. Rochester's character, but I do know that he offered marriage to this young woman, but at the altar she had discovered he had a wife still living, a lunatic.
Jane refuses to take the easy way out and become Rochester's mistress, so she runs away from Thornfield and through a series of unlikely coincidences ends up living with her cousin St. John Rivers. He proposes marriage, but Jane still loves Rochester.
He must have been a bad man.
You do not know him.
Very well.
When she meets St. John Rivers, we enter a sort of lull in the book that's very often criticised, and people often reading it feel, you know, where's the book going now? And they want to get back to the Rochester story. But in fact, I think it's tremendously important in how the book influenced the young female reader, because it's where Jane really does refuse the life that would have been comfortable for her. She really shows her independence of mind at that point.
On the face of it, a man who marries a woman with mental health problems for her money, locks her away in the attic, and then tries to inveigle an innocent young girl into a bigamous union is hardly Mr. Right. And yet Mr. Rochester, for all his faults, has never been short of female fans.
Well, he's sexy as hell, he's saturnine and dark, he's very masculine, he's ironic, he's got a sense of humour, which can be slightly cruel, as when he teases Jane by dressing up as a fortune teller in order to get her to reveal the secrets of her heart. But the main thing about him is that he's vulnerable, and that makes him even more sexy. He's this very powerful man who reveals his vulnerability.
What about Rochester? Mr. Rochester.
Well, he's very irritating. He calls her Jane every second sentence, which I find Jane. I think he would be slightly. I can't help it. I now see Mr. Blunkett continually as Mr. Rochester, and so not that I don't think Mr. Blunkett's splendid in many ways, but it slightly blurred my image of Rochester, who was heaven in the old days.
Part of the Bronte myth has always been that the sisters were unworldly spinsters locked away in the tiny rooms of their Haworth parsonage. However, this isn't strictly true.
Partly because they are parsons' daughters, they're having to look after the women in the parish who've, been raped or dealt. There's one of the curate's wives ended up with syphilis. So the Brontes are not complete innocents. They do know what's going on, and they were aware of sexual love, of physical love. But you never get that actually on the page. It's always sort of inferred, I think.
Charlotte describes Mr. Rochester with almost erotic meticulousness. He's almost as smouldering as the cigars he smoked. Charlotte took the cigars, but not the mad wife, from the great unrequited passion of her life, Monsieur Heger. In 1842, when she was 26, Charlotte went to Brussels to study French and German, and while she was there, she met and fell in love with her professor.
What Heger did that was different was that he was the first person outside her own family to appreciate her intellectual talents. He has no idea that this 26-year-old is sort of, falling madly in love with him. He's a happily married man with loads of small children. But he responded to something in her, and she clearly needed that and responded to it. And It was the great passion of her life, there's no question. Monsieur Heger was physically totally unlike Rochester, but he had that same wit, he had that same sarcastic temperament that Rochester has. And we know, for instance, that when he went in her desk, she knew that he'd been there because there was a lingering smell of cigar smoke, which she found deeply erotic. And so in Jane Eyre, in the novel itself, when Jane's walking past on the terrace, she knows Mr. Rochester is in the room because she can smell the lingering scent of cigar smoke. So she uses those experiences, which were outside her normal experience in Haworth, to give life to the character of Rochester, who otherwise would be quite a wooden character, really.
He's a great hero. And the reason for that is really because he's so honest and he sees Jane when no one else does, and that's the real attraction. That's why he's so sexy.
I think Mr. Rochester would be an appalling husband. I think he'd whine, I think he'd moan, he'd be demanding. You know that he's a liar because he's hidden a first wife from you, so how do you know he's not going to lock you in the attic when the next young thing comes along?
When Jane Eyre finally returns to Thornfield, she finds the house burnt to the ground and its owner hideously disfigured. This doesn't seem to put Jane off, though.
Is it you, Jane? What is it? This is her shape.
And this her voice. She is all here, her heart too.
Jane,
I think Jane Eyre is at heart a female fantasy about the possibility of changing a man. Rochester is this rake who's had lots and lots of mistresses. He's had this nightmare marriage. Jane is the one who's finally going to change him and finally going to tame him. And it is significant that he needs to be blinded and symbolically castrated before Jane can achieve that.
Hitherto I have hated to be helped, to be led. Henceforth, I feel I shall hate it no more. I did not like to put my hand into a hireling's, but it is pleasant to feel it circled by Jane's little fingers. I preferred utter loneliness to the constant attendance of servants, but Jane's soft ministry will be a perpetual joy. Jane suits me. Do I suit her?
Figures like Rochester seem to be transformed radically during the course of the book, and that of course also taps into a classic human fantasy, the idea that a man can change, and in particular that a woman can be the cause of a man changing.
But Rochester isn't just changed, he's also maimed and blinded.
But isn't the maiming and blinding of Rochester a kind of metaphor for the actual process of becoming human? We can say, what's the difference between infatuation and love? We can be infatuated by an ideal image, someone who seems perfect, to have no flaws. That kind of infatuation doesn't seem to last very long. Love, on the contrary, is always directed towards a lack. It's when an image becomes wounded. So love is always revolving around lack. And in these books, when the hero suddenly becomes crippled, maimed, or loses their fortune, it's a kind of metaphor for this process of losing something, for lacking something, and in that way, becoming capable of human love.